Normally, the HTML tables expand to accommodate the contents of the cells. My table here is an example. Notice if I add more text to one of those rows, here is another row and some more text. Let's save that. Notice when I refresh this in the browser, the table expands to accommodate that extra content in the table cell. Once the table expands to the limits of its container object, this would be a div tag, a browser window, or another table, the contents of the cell will wrap. Let me demonstrate this by adding quite a bit more text. So I have a lot more text here, like so. Let's go ahead and save this and open this up in the browser again by refreshing. And notice if I change the width of my browser, the content in that table row will wrap down to the next line. But notice the table itself fills the entire width of its container. In this case, it's the browser. This could be a div tag or another table. You can nest tables inside of other tables. In many cases, you'll want to manually size your table widths rather than just leave them to the whims of the user. Do this with the table width attribute using a percentage or a fixed pixel width. If I want to choose a percentage, I would type width equals and then the percentage in quotation marks. The percentage width will vary the table dynamically to the size of its container. So if I set this to 50%, the new table will be exactly 50% of the width of the container. So if we look at this new table now with a 50% width, notice that as I expand my browser to the right, my table shrinks or expands so that at all times it's about 50% of the total width of the container. Here's another example of a table with the percentage width set up here in the table tag. This time, however, the table is inside of a div tag and I've set the width to 70%. So if we look at this page in the browser, notice the table width is set to 70% of this div tag. So as this div tag expands and shrinks, this table will also expand and shrink. So in this case, it's always 70% of its container. You can also specify an exact width of the table. Do this by setting the table value to pixels. For example, if you need a table that is exactly 400 pixels wide, I can set this value right here to 400px. Let's save this and look at it in the browser. Notice that that shrunk just a little bit from the previous 70%. Let's set this to 200 and you'll really notice a change in that width of the table. Now it's very short, but that's fixed. That won't change even if I adjust the size of my div tag or adjust the size of my browser. Back to my previous example, here I have the table on the page, not in the div tag, and I've set the width to a fixed width of 50 pixels, and notice that here, no matter how small I make my browser, that table stays 50 pixels wide. Now keep in mind that if the specified table width exceeds the width of its container, the size will be adjusted to the size of the container. So in other words, if I put this in a div tag that's only 400 pixels wide and I set my table width to 500 pixels wide, it will stay at 400 pixels wide to accommodate the width of the container. One exception are containers that support horizontal scroll bars. If the container does support scroll bars, the table will be sized as instructed in the container, and you'll spawn scroll bars to accommodate the full width. I never recommend having horizontal scrolling, but it is possible in some cases to have that happen. Now, besides specifying the width of a full table, you can also specify the width of each column within each table using width attributes in the th and td tags, or by specifying width with the column or column group tags. I'll be covering these techniques a little bit later. Let's now move on and talk about cell spacing and cell padding in your table cells.